1946. The war was over, or so they said. But for one woman, it hadn't ended at all. At the edge of Kure Harbor, where the water shimmered with oil and memory, Aiko Sato stood every evening, a single paper flower in her hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. The radio spoke of peace, of reconstruction, of men returning home on crowded repatriation ships. But not him. Never him. Her husband, Private Masaru Sato, had vanished in the jungles of the Philippines. The army told her he was missing. The neighbors whispered he was dead. But Aiko, she believed otherwise, because a week before surrender, she had received his final letter. It was dated after the day his unit was reported destroyed. That single impossible detail became her entire world. "Every ship that docks," she said softly, "I will wait." For months, she stood there, through snow, through rain, through silence, watching others reunite. And somewhere, in the classified drawers of an American intelligence office, Masaru's name appeared once, marked in red, status, missing beyond recovery. But fate has a cruel sense of humor, because months later, a message surfaced from a POW camp in Manila, and on that list was his name again. How could man die twice? And what did the empire hide about the men it left behind? What began as a wife's hope would unravel into one of the most haunting, untold stories of post-war Japan. A secret buried under silence, pride, and the weight of a love that refused to die. Beat. This is the story of the woman who waited for a ship that never came. The year was 1944, and Japan was bleeding from every corner of the map. Cities turned to ash under the drone of B-29s. Food was a rumor. Hope was rationed. And yet, somewhere between those collapsing front lines, a letter found its way from the Philippines to a small wooden house overlooking the Seto Inland Sea. It began simply, "My dearest Aiko, the nights are long, but when I close my eyes, I see the lanterns by the harbor. I imagine you still lighting them." His handwriting wavered, half erased by rain and mud. The envelope smelled faintly of salt and smoke. For Aiko, every word was a heartbeat pulled across the ocean. She read it again and again, until the paper softened beneath her fingers. Outside, neighbors whispered of the coming defeat. But inside that little home, love staged its quiet rebellion. While the emperor promised divine victory, Aiko and Masaru promised each other something far smaller, but infinitely more human: survival. Each week she would write back, carefully, obediently, because in wartime Japan, even love had to pass through the censor's blades. Behind office doors in Tokyo, thousands of clerks opened every letter from the front. Words like hunger, fear, or retreat were blotted out with black ink. Only loyalty and duty were allowed to live on paper. So Aiko wrote what they wanted to see. "I am proud of you. The chrysanthemums are blooming. When the war ends, we'll rebuild." But beneath the practiced phrases, she hid her own code. A single extra brushstroke, a missing punctuation mark, tiny secrets only Masaru would understand. In a world where truth could be punished, they used grammar as rebellion. Then one day, the pattern changed. Weeks passed. No letter came. She told herself the censors were slow, or that supply lines were broken. But deep down, she felt it, the pause that meant something had gone terribly wrong. Because silence in wartime was never empty. It was heavy, intentional, a silence that could crush. Meanwhile, in the humid swamps of Leyte, Masaru's unit was living a nightmare the newspapers never dared print. Cut off, surrounded, living on rainwater and rice husks. The officers read the emperor's command: "You will fight to the last man. No surrender, no return." Masaru wrote one final letter on the back of a discarded supply form. "Tell the sea I tried to come home." He tucked it into his breast pocket. He would never post it. Back in Kure, Aiko kept lighting the lantern each night, her silent signal to the horizon. Neighbors said it was foolish, even dangerous. American planes were bombing the harbor, and lights were forbidden. But Aiko whispered, "He'll find his way by this." On the night of the emperor's broadcast, Japan's surrender, the radio static carried words no one had ever heard before. "We must endure the unendurable." As the voice faded, Aiko's hands trembled around Masaru's last letter. She pressed it to her chest, and for the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to cry. When morning came, she walked down to the harbor and waited. The air smelled of diesel and despair. Ships burned on the horizon, their masts leaning like crosses. She thought of all the men who would never step onto these docks again. But somewhere in that chaos, she felt it, a pull, almost superstitious. Masaru was still out there. He had promised. He had to come home. And so, the war ended for Japan, but not for her. Because when a letter stops coming, you don't bury the man, you bury the future. Beat, that night, as the first post-war ships limped into Kure, Aiko joined the other wives at the waterfront, holding faded photographs to the sea breeze. The world celebrated peace. She only felt absence, and in the weeks that followed, she would learn that silence can lie louder than words. The surrender had come and gone, yet Japan felt nothing like peace. Streets were filled with ghosts, some wearing uniforms, some wearing grief. Burned-out cities tried to pretend they could start again, but the air itself smelled of loss. For Aiko, the end of the war didn't bring relief, it brought questions. The military offices that once delivered letters were now silent, their walls lined with women clutching photographs. She joined them, waiting her turn, her hands tight around Masaru's last envelope like it could still speak. Inside, an officer shuffled papers without looking up. "Sato Masaru," he repeated flatly. "Unit 21, Leyte Campaign. Listed as detained." The word struck her like a bullet. Detained. Not dead. Not alive. Just suspended. "What does that mean?" she whispered. The man didn't answer. He simply stamped a form and slid it across the counter. In red ink it read, "Status, unknown." Outside, rumors spread faster than food. Some said the prisoners were being repatriated through Manila. Others claimed the Americans had sunk the transport ships carrying them home. Names floated through the markets like ghosts. Arisa Maru, Junyo Maru, Tamahoko Maru. Ships that never reached Japan, each holding thousands of men. Each a floating grave. Aiko refused to believe Masaru was one of them. Every night, she walked to Kure Harbor and counted the ships that returned, memorizing the faces of every man who stepped onto the pier. They looked nothing like the men who'd left, hollow cheeks, eyes like shuttered windows. She watched one soldier collapse into his mother's arms and wondered if she'd ever feel that weight again. Then came a whisper that changed everything. A fisherman told her of a survivor, someone from Leyte, found in Okinawa. The man was said to have escaped a sinking ship. His story traveled like wind through the refugee camps. A prisoner transport, torpedoed by an American submarine, men clinging to debris for hours. Only a handful survived. Among them, a soldier who had shouted a name before the waves swallowed him, Sato. Aiko's heart caught fire. She scraped together what little money she had and boarded a train south, chasing a rumor across the ruins of her own country. The journey to Okinawa took days. Crowded trains, broken bridges, checkpoints where American soldiers eyed her papers with suspicion. But she didn't care. Every mile felt like one step closer to him. The hospital was nothing more than a row of tents by the shore. Inside, the smell of iodine and sweat clung to everything. Dozens of wounded men lay in silence. When Aiko whispered Masaru's name, a nurse hesitated, then led her to a thin man staring blankly at the ceiling. His body was scarred, his face barely recognizable. "He's the one who mentioned that name," the nurse said. Aiko knelt beside him. "You said?" "Sato," she whispered. His eyes flickered. "Yes," he rasped. "Sato-san saved me. Told me to swim north before the ship exploded." His voice cracked. He went back to help others. She wanted to ask more, but his breathing faltered, his body trembling with fever. The nurse pulled her back. "He won't last the night," she said. Aiko stepped outside, staring at the Black Sea. The waves rolled in slow, heavy, deliberate, as if carrying messages from men the world had already buried. Could Masaru have survived twice? Once from the jungle, again from the sea? The question became her new obsession. She traveled to Tokyo to search the government archives, now under American supervision. The offices were crowded with widows like her, their faces pale, their hopes stubborn. On a bulletin board labeled repatriation lists, she found pages of names typed by U.S. personnel. For hours, she traced every line, every Sato. There were hundreds. None matched his service number. Then, tucked between two pages, she found something strange. A carbon copy of a telegram marked restricted. It listed men reported missing from Leyte, with a note at the bottom, some captured by U.S. forces, Manila. And there, faint but legible, was Sato. The date was October 1944, months after his supposed death. Aiko froze. That one letter, that single mark of ink, was proof he had lived beyond what the government admitted. But why had no one told her? She confronted the clerk in charge, waving the document. He glanced at it and frowned. "You shouldn't have seen this," he said. "These names were meant to be removed." "Removed?" Her voice rose. "Why would you remove the names of the living?" He looked away. "Because the Americans only returned those deemed fit for release. Some they classified differently." "What does that mean?" He hesitated. "It means some men were sent elsewhere. Siberia, perhaps. The government doesn't want the public to know." The word hung in the air. Siberia. Cold. Endless. A place that swallowed men whole. Aiko stepped back, her knees weak. She had come searching for answers, but the truth only led deeper into shadows. That night, as she rode the train home, she watched the landscape blur by. Villages half rebuilt, temples without roofs, children playing among ruins. Japan was learning to forget. But Aiko couldn't. She pressed Masuru's last letter against the train window, whispering, "If you're out there, I'll find you." Outside, the reflection of her face merged with the passing lights, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw him in the glass, tired, smiling, reaching out. Was it memory or a promise? The war had ended, yet its secrets were only beginning to surface. And somewhere in those sealed archives, under red stamps and fading ink, was proof that love had outlasted truth itself. By 1947, Japan was a country living between memory and denial. The Allied occupation had turned Tokyo into a forest of foreign uniforms and loudspeakers, their voices echoing commands in broken Japanese. Newspapers printed words like democracy and reconstruction, but for millions of women, the only word that mattered was repatriation. Their war had not ended. It had only changed shape. Aiko joined the lines at Kure Harbor again, her hair streaked with gray she didn't remember earning. Each week, new ships returned, packed with hollow-eyed men wrapped in U.S. blankets. They looked like shadows pretending to be soldiers. Every reunion was a spectacle. Tears, laughter, fainting. But for Aiko, the pier was a stage where hope died in silence. Each face that wasn't as cut deeper. Still, she kept searching. The Americans had begun releasing lists of prisoners, typed in English, posted outside government offices. She couldn't read the words, but she copied every name with trembling care. Late at night, by oil lamp, she matched each one against her memories, whispering every Sato like a prayer. Then, one afternoon, a young interpreter named David Miller approached her at the Yokohama Repatriation Center. He had noticed her persistence, the same woman returning every week, notebook in hand. "You're looking for someone?" he asked in hesitant Japanese. "My husband," she replied softly. "Sato Masaru." He frowned, flipping through a stack of forms. "There are many Satos." "What unit?" 21st Leyte. David's eyes narrowed. "That's odd. I saw that name before. But not here." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a folded carbon copy. An American intelligence document stamped POW transfer list, Camp Number 14, Manila. He pointed to the line. "Sato, Mta. Unverified transfer." Aiko's breath caught. "Transfer? Where?" David hesitated. "That's the strange part. There's no destination listed. Usually it says repatriation, hospital, or execution. This one it's blank. Blank. A word that said everything and nothing at once. She stared at the paper, her mind spinning. The date, January 1945. That was months after the Aris and Maru had sunk. Masaru had survived longer than anyone believed. But if he wasn't repatriated, where had he gone? David leaned closer. You didn't hear this from me, but some POWs were transferred north after the war, Soviet territory. The Americans suspected the Russians took them. He lowered his voice. You should stop digging. These records, some weren't meant to be found. But Aiko couldn't stop. She had crossed the line between grief and obsession. What if he was still alive, somewhere behind those icy borders? What if he was waiting for her, the same way she waited for him? In the following weeks, she haunted libraries and occupied offices, reading every translated bulletin she could find. Each document told a different version of the same lie. Some claimed all Japanese prisoners were home. Others hinted at special cases under foreign custody. And yet, Masaru's name appeared again and again, in faded ink, in copies of copies, never confirmed, never erased. One night, David found her asleep at a desk piled with papers. He placed a tin of biscuits beside her hand. You can't keep doing this, he said gently. Sometimes not knowing is mercy. Aiko looked up, her eyes hollow but fierce. If you lost someone, would you want mercy or truth? He didn't answer. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows of the repatriation office. Aiko's papers fluttered like ghosts. Hundreds of names, each representing a life misplaced by history. The Americans would later call them administrative errors. The Japanese government would call them unfortunate omissions. But for the women who waited at the docks, they were simply husbands who never came home. Weeks later, an anonymous envelope arrived at Aiko's door. Inside was a single page, no signature, no seal. The words were typed in English. POW Camp Number 14, Manila. Records sealed by U.S. Command. Confirmed transfers. Soviet Zone, 1945. At the bottom, one final line. Almost an afterthought. Sato M. Presumed alive. Her hands trembled. Could it be? After everything, bombs, jungles, the sinking ship, he might still be breathing, half a world away? But joy was quickly replaced by dread. If he was alive, why hadn't anyone brought him home? That night, she dreamed of a frozen wasteland. Men digging through snow, faces wrapped in rags, chains glinting under pale light. Masaru stood among them, his breath a cloud, his eyes still searching the horizon. He turned toward her in the dream, whispering something she couldn't hear over the wind. When she awoke, she knew the trail was leading beyond Japan's shores. Her search for truth had become dangerous. Files went missing. The clerk who once helped her was suddenly transferred. Even David stopped showing up. Still, she kept going, because some truths demand to be found, no matter the cost. The next lead would take her back to the harbor, the same harbor where she had once lit lanterns for his return. But this time, she wouldn't come await. She would come to confront the ghosts of men who were never supposed to exist. By 1949, Japan had rebuilt its skeleton but not its soul. Neon lights flickered over streets that still smelled of ashes. The Americans called it progress. Aiko called it forgetting. Every corner of Kure whispered the same message. Move on, rebuild, erase. But she couldn't. Not when every sound of a ship's horn still made her heart race. The harbor had become her chapel. The tides her prayers. Women still gathered there, clutching photographs like offerings, staring at the horizon as though it could give back what the war had taken. But Aiko was different. She wasn't there for hope anymore. She was there for proof. Rumors began circulating of a final repatriation ship, a vessel returning from the Soviet Union with men once thought dead. Some said they were POWs released after years of forced labor. Others said they were spies, exchanged in secret. The name on the manifest hit her like lightning. Sato. Her knees nearly gave out. She didn't breathe for a full minute. It couldn't be coincidence. After years of chasing ghosts, the sea was finally whispering his name back to her. For the next 2 days, she barely slept. She mended her best kimono, the one she wore at their wedding, and brought it to the harbor. The docks were alive with noise. Reporters, officials, wives who'd refused to let go. The air vibrated with equal parts fear and hope. Aiko stood at the front rail, eyes burning from salt and anticipation. In the distance, the ship emerged from the mist, a gray silhouette dragging its shadow across the water. The band began to play, awkward and offbeat, trying to sound like celebration. When the ramp lowered, silence fell. One by one, the men stepped off. Some walked with canes. Some didn't walk at all. Faces were swollen, skin like parchment, hair gone white before its time. Women cried. Screamed names collapsed into trembling arms. Aiko scanned each face with the precision of prayer. Each step, each breath, her chest tightened. Until a man stumbled forward. His uniform hung in rags. His eyes darted as though they couldn't stand the daylight. For a heartbeat, she thought it was him. Her lips parted, ready to call his name. But when he turned, she froze. The man's face was wrong, older, broken, but the scar along his jaw, it was identical to Masaru's. She pushed through the crowd, shouting, "Sato! Masaru!" The man looked up. For a moment, recognition flickered, then faded. He shook his head. "No, I'm not him." She felt her knees buckle, but before she could turn away, he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "He saved me," he whispered hoarsely. "Sato-san, he saved me." Aiko's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "He was in Siberia," the man said, eyes wet. "He was alive. He took my place on the exchange list. Said I had a wife and child waiting. He stayed behind." The dock blurred around her. The sounds faded until there was only the rush of blood in her ears. Masaru had survived, but he had chosen not to come home. He had traded his life so another could return. The realization crushed and lifted her all at once. He hadn't abandoned her. He had kept his promise in the only way he could, by ensuring someone else found their harbor. Aiko knelt by the water's edge that evening, her paper flower trembling in her hands. She released it into the tide and whispered, "You came home, just not the way I expected." As the flower drifted away, she imagined it crossing the Pacific, riding currents toward a frozen shore where her husband's name was spoken one last time. The news of the Vladivostok ship spread across Japan, but few cared for the details. The government filed its reports, the Americans closed their archives, and life marched on. For the world, the war was history. For Aiko, it was eternity. Weeks passed. She stopped checking the bulletins, stopped writing to ministries that never replied. But every evening, she still walked to the harbor. Same time, same place, just before dusk, because some habits are stronger than despair. The fishermen began calling her the widow of the tide. To them, she was a ghost in her own right. Always there, always waiting, a silhouette against the setting sun. But deep down, Aiko knew she wasn't waiting anymore. She was remembering. And remembrance, she realized, was its own kind of homecoming. By the time the 1970s arrived, Japan had become a country of light. Neon signs blinked where sirens once screamed, and bullet trains carved silver lines across the land. The world saw a miracle of recovery. But on the edge of Kure Harbor, time still moved at the speed of memory. Aiko Sato was an old woman now. Her hair, once black as ink, had turned the color of sea foam. Her small wooden house overlooked the same water where she'd once stood, waiting for a ship that never came. Every evening she still placed Masaru's photograph on the windowsill facing the horizon, as if it could signal the sea to answer back. Neighbors whispered that she was mad. The war ended 30 years ago, they said. Why can't she let it rest? But love does not obey calendars. It lingers, haunting the spaces between what was and what should have been. That winter, a letter arrived from Tokyo. Not handwritten, not personal, official. From the Ministry of Health and Welfare. Inside was a single line that stopped her heart cold. Recently declassified documents from the United States confirmed that Sato, Masaru, Private First Class, was recorded alive in Soviet custody, 1950. She read it again and again, lips trembling. The date was 5 years after Japan's surrender. He hadn't died in battle or on the Aris in Maru. He had survived the impossible, only to vanish into the Siberian snow. The paper slipped from her hands. For a long moment, the room filled only with the sound of the sea. It wasn't grief that came this time. It was something quieter, heavier, understanding. Masaru had kept his promise in a way she could finally see. He had survived long enough for her to keep hoping. Long enough for her love to have meaning. Aiko rose slowly, her joints stiff, her breath shallow. She walked to the window and watched the tide pull in. Outside, children were laughing, their voices high and pure. The city had forgotten the language of sorrow, but the sea, it remembered everything. That night, she went down to the harbor one last time. The docks were silent now, reclaimed by salt and rust. She carried with her the first letter Masaru had ever sent. Its ink faded to a soft gray. She knelt by the edge of the water and whispered, "You can rest now." Then she released the letter. The tide took it gently, carrying it into the darkness. In that moment, Aiko didn't see the brokenness of her country or the cruelty of its silence. She saw only the miracle that she had loved someone so deeply that even history could not erase him. When dawn came, fishermen passing by saw her sitting by the pier, head bowed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked peaceful, as if listening to a distant voice only she could hear. They called out to her, but she didn't move. The sea had finally answered her back. Days later, local papers ran a small story. Elderly woman found at Kure Harbor. Beside her, a photograph of a soldier and a single paper flower. No one knew who she was, until a historian recognized the name from forgotten repatriation lists. That same historian traveled to her home and found boxes of preserved letters, still sealed, each one addressed to Masaru Sato, Camp No. 14, Manila. In 1971, those letters were displayed in a small exhibition on wartime correspondence. Visitors stood in silence as they read them, ordinary words written by an extraordinary love. Many wept. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stared at the final letter that ended with the line, "If you cannot come home, I will keep waiting until the sea tells me you did." The historian later said, "She turned grief into devotion, and devotion into history." Aiko Sato was buried on a small hill overlooking Kure Harbor. Every year, on the anniversary of Japan's surrender, someone still leaves a paper flower on her grave. No one knows who. Maybe a descendant of the man Masaru saved. Maybe just a stranger who heard her story. But the sea knows. The sea always remembers. Because love, like the tide, may retreat for years, but it always finds its way home. The camera drifts above Kure Harbor, the water a mirror of dusk. The horizon bleeds into gold, then gray. A paper flower floats, spinning slowly, carried by the current out toward the open sea. A voice begins, soft, almost like memory. History remembers nations, battles, victories. But the truest wars are fought in silence and waiting. We move past the shoreline, over rusted cranes, abandoned docks, the remnants of a world rebuilt on forgetting. Then, through archival footage, the faces of POWs stepping off ships, the weeping wives, the mountains of letters never opened. For every soldier who came home, another never did. But somewhere, someone still waited, refusing to let the sea have the final word. Aiko's photograph fades into view, her eyes calm, her smile small but unbroken. The narrator continues. She waited at the harbor for a ship that never came. And in that waiting, she built a monument stronger than stone, faith, the kind that defies time, governments, and war itself. A brief silence, then a whisper, almost as if carried on wind and tide. "Masaru, you came home." The music swells, strings trembling like hell breath. The screen fills with black and white photos of other unnamed families, their eyes locked on horizons we can't see. If her story moved you, remember, there are still thousands of untold names buried in the quiet corners of history. Their stories wait, too. A pause. Then the final line, subscribe to hear them. Because every forgotten soul deserves its return. The screen fades to black. Then, one final image. The sea at night, a single paper flower glowing under the moonlight, drifting endlessly home.